This is the Latin News Podcast. I'm Richard McColl, your host here in Bogota, Colombia. This week, I'm speaking to Latin American Analyst Andrew Thompson. We're going to be discussing a new report he has authored entitled Sanctions in Latin America, the Regrettable Rise in the World of Prohibitions. So we're going to be talking all about these. Obviously, we have issues in Nicaragua, issues in Venezuela and Cuba, obviously a historical example there, but let's let him jump right in. Andrew, welcome back on the Latin News Podcast.
Good to talk to you, Richard.
It's an absolute pleasure. I read all 17 pages of the report, fascinating report. And I think we just start with the basics. The aim of sanctions as we know them is that they're designed to force governments to defend business interests or restore or seek democracy, respect human rights, protect the environment, fight corruption, and tackle international crime. Is we're on the right background there?
Yes, we are, and perhaps I could say something that's not in the report, which I discovered later. You might want to ask me about the history of sanctions. So I did a little bit of preparation, and it turns out that the first known sanctions were applied in the year 432 BC, before Christ, or before the Common Era, as it's called. And it was down to the Empire of Athens, who had some kind of a falling out with a city-state to the northwest called Megara. And Athens said that there would be no products from Megara in any of its marketplaces until Megara sort of stood down and accepted the preeminence of the empire of the Athenians. So arguably things haven't changed too much. Go forward two millennia, and sanctions still seem about one government telling another one, you can't do that, and I'm sanctioning you, and you come around to my way of thinking.
Yeah, quickly, and were the Athenians successful?
I don't really know. I think the implication, I haven't read enough of it, but the implication was that they were, and that the merchants of Megara had to knuckle down and make the concessions, join the empire, so to speak.
Well, I mean, it's an interesting thing to fall back on, because obviously we all have very different opinions on the nature of sanctions, whether they're successful or not. As you said, it's the state of one government imposing their will on another government. If we put this obviously we need to put this into Latin American context for this podcast. I kind of feel that we need to discuss really Cuba as the first place jumping off, because I mean these date back. I have the date, but I'm sure it's more fresh in your mind. When did sanctions begin on Cuba by the U.S.?
They began in 1962. So you have the victory of the Cuban Revolution in 1959. There's an initial period where there's a belief that Fidel Castro might be just a sort of a left-leaning Democrat. And it turns out quite quickly that he is more committed to the Communist Party and to a Marxist approach. So in that process, and during which we also have the invasion of the Bay of Pigs, and if you like, the US behaving in a fairly imperial manner, as a result of that, what they initially did was there was a law already on the US statute book, which is the Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917, which was designed to allow the US to stop trading with opponents such as Germany in the First World War. So they invoked that and added on a new act and gave the US president the authority to ban all trade with Cuba, and hence began a period of 6 decades, or to be precise, 62 years, during which the US has systematically applied the trade embargo and in the eyes of many, it has been a total failure because 6 decades, this was typical. The US saying, we don't like what Cuba's doing. We are going to apply pressure and force it to change its behavior. And you have the Cuban side saying, we're not going to accept that. We're going to resist it every step of the way. And the two positions get, if you like, solidified, someone would say ossified, and it becomes a permanent thing, even though by any calculation, it has failed. It hasn't really, over the years, changed control by the Cuban Communist Party. It hasn't turned Cuba into a more democratic country. So, the question may be, why keep on doing it? And there are a number of possible answers to that. One due to the fact that Cuban Americans and conservative Hispanic Americans are a powerful electoral force in US politics. So any relaxation of the sanctions against Cuba goes down badly with important swing voters.
Of course, and as you said, the sanctions have not hastened the end of communist rule in Cuba. And of course, Fidel Castro was able to double down, putting Raúl, his brother, in power, and then Efraín Canedo as well. I mean, we're going to a proper, there's no step towards a more democratic, let's say, development or evolution there in Cuba. Would you say it's just an aggressive, you mentioned the word imperial, but an aggressive carrying out of the Roosevelt corollary of the Monroe Doctrine?
Yes, I did mention the word imperial. And I think what we find in the world in general is that superpowers tend to think quite favorably about sanctions. Partly because, there can be various reasons for it, but if you look at the three main sources of sanctions at the moment, they are the United Nations, the European Union, and the United States. And the United States applies far, far more sanctions than anyone else. So if you actually count the number of sanctions, it turns out that the UN can more or less sanctioning 30 countries. The European Union is around the same number, and the United States has around 12,000 sanctions. That's comprehensive sanctions applied to an entire country, or targeted sanctions, which are applied to individuals and entities that the US highlights. And I think somehow caught up in this is the willingness of a sanctioning country to be a little bit like one of the world's policemen. It feels it has the right to enforce these things. And I think that's kind of connected in the US case with what analysts have called US exceptionalism, which basically maintains that the same rules don't apply to everyone. If you are a superpower, you can apply special rules, which other countries might want to apply but shouldn't. So it's kind of caught up in this idea of exceptionalism.
You say this exceptionalism and the way this blanket, I would say, all-encompassing sanction on Cuba, it would have started out. I mean, we're looking. You said 1962 is the heart of the Cold War. It's more of a security policy purpose, but over time this has evolved, really, isn't it? I would say it's more of a straight up punishing foreign policy.
Yes, and I think the interesting thing here is that you can argue it various ways. And one, if you like, disrespectful argument is to suggest that there's a bit of George Orwell's 1984 going on here. It may be stepping out of line a bit, but there's an argument in that two rival countries at war with each other may be useful to solidify domestic rule and overcome objections. So, one suggestion is that although he denounced it all his life, Fidel Castro might have survived longer than he otherwise would because of sanctions. Because everything that goes wrong in Cuban society, and there's quite a lot going wrong with the economy and so on, you can say, it's sanctions. The US caused it. The US is our enemy. You're worried that there's not enough food in supermarkets, the cost of living, unemployment. It's not me. It's not the Communist Party of Cuba. It's Uncle Sam who's doing it. And that's, if you like, I think one of the really surprising things is that the Cuban trade embargo has simply gone on for more than a generation. And where in the world you find a policy that is more unsuccessful yet survives for so long? So there's one argument. I mean, it's true that different US presidents have tried to calibrate sanctions, notably under Barack Obama. There was a significant opening to Cuba, re-establishment of diplomatic relations, and a beginning of a relaxation of sanctions. There's an argument that had that continued, it might have been more subversive for a Cuban society which was looking to make changes than maintaining sanctions. So I know that's a kind of Orwellian argument, but the idea is, he had in 1984 Ministry of War and Ministry of Peace that were basically about indoctrinating the local population.
Well, of course, I mean, when you have the universal figure of distrust or the hate figure, it's very easy or much more straightforward to consolidate power. You have in this report the troubling figure of that this US financial and trade embargo has cost Cuba over $130 billion in lost revenue. And of course, as I said earlier, it has not hastened the end of communist rule. Who has suffered? It's the people. I don't see anything changing.
The argument for sanctions is that they cause pain, economic pain in the sanctioned country, and force it to change its behavior. In the case of Cuba, would be to hold democratic elections, relax the political situation, and so on. As far as I can see, based on the research I've done, that first bit, sanctions cause economic pain, is true. Like if we're making an argument in various steps, being sanctioned is not good, it's bad for the economy. But the next step, therefore the government caves in, is not, doesn't follow logically at all. I've already suggested it might say, therefore, government solidifies its position. And there is some academic work which suggests that when autocrats are sanctioned, they tend to increase the clampdown. So I think we can say sanctions cause pain, but sanctions on their own do not force regime change. And that's kind of, if you look back over from the Cold War onwards, it may be that in some cases they will help regime change. But I think that's only when a lot of other things are going on. This is something that we may come back to, perhaps when we talk about Venezuela or other countries. Economic pain does not equal political liberalization. Economic pain plus other events which many people and countries can't control, splits in the ruling party, unexpected problems in the economy, all sorts of surprises. Taken together, they could have, or they can have, more of an effect.
when there was the civil unrest in Cuba, then it could have that could have created a situation in which you said, well, it's been 60 years of sanctions and potentially this is easing us into a different era. But of course, it was cracked down so fast that we're back, I would say, to square one, because after the Barack Obama presidency, then you have Trump, who comes in and immediately says, as president, Cuba is a state sponsor of terrorism. And it sets it all back. And of course, under President Biden, there's been no, lifting, as far as I know. And then we should probably address it right now under either a future President Harris or a future President Trump. Potentially Harris, should she win, would be a little more favorable towards Cuba. I mean, but again, we're just supposing here. It's spitballing. And Trump wouldn't change the position at all.
I think that the kind of the first thought is that a renewed Trump presidency would lead to a renewed tightening of sanctions against Cuba. He's been known, not only in the Cuban case, but also in Venezuela, of favoring what he called maximum pressure against these governments. So that might happen. On the other hand, it's also worth bearing in mind that typically during his first presidency, Trump just didn't really think about Latin America very much. And he made some statements about Venezuela, which were, seemed to say nothing was off the table, including a military invasion. So there's an element of uncertainty with the Trump presidency, how he would reconsider his position. If we have a Harris presidency, I think that yes, there will be more a tendency, and that traditionally there's a tendency among Democrat presidents to see if there can be some relaxation of sanctions against Cuba. But with Harris, as with other Democrat presidents, the important thing is Miami,
Yes.
Florida, such a significant electoral group of Cuban Americans that would take offense at any relaxation of policy. I'm not saying that Harris wouldn't favor an opening to Cuba. I'm just saying she would certainly be looking over her shoulder at what the electoral implications in the United States might be, bearing in mind that there's already quite a lot of pressure on her relating to immigration. General feeling that Trump's wall, or certainly his policy against immigration, is quite popular electorally, for good or for bad. Even though the latest figures show that immigration across the U.S. border has come down. So I think that we can't say with Harris there'd be a clear ditching of the sanctions policy. You'd probably, I think it's gone on for so long that you'd probably need some kind of bipartisan agreement, just as efforts to control migration do involve talks between the Democrats and the Republicans. I think on an issue as big as a Cuban embargo, you'd also need some kind of bipartisan agreement, and that would depend on how the elections go in November, who's got what share of the votes in the Senate and the House of Representatives. So it's to be confirmed, to be.
And I don't see the usual suspects in the Republican Party, freeing up any space for dialogue on that. Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, I don't. But enough of them. There was something that came up earlier in the conversation when you talked about the usual the places that place sanctions, the UN, the US, and the EU. And an issue that popped up, and a piece of data that popped up in this report, is that it seems that Latin America is disproportionately sanctioned. And you put in October 2021, there were 1,990 sanctions placed by the US on Latin America and the Caribbean, and 1,897 of these, or 95% of them, are by the US. I find that it's quite overwhelming, but of course the US, as you said, and you talked about sort of a global police force, and of course we are sitting in their political, geographical sphere of influence. But why so much? Why are we seen as a top priority here in Latin America and the Caribbean?
I have to confess to a possible misinterpretation.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely, the political consultancy that I was quoting, Castellum AI, does say that there is, that Latin America and the Caribbean are disproportionately sanctioned, and they come to those numbers. However, when they say that, they aren't necessarily comparing like with like, because they're saying that Latin America is more sanctioned than Iran and North Korea. But those are countries. So we're comparing a region of Latin America with individual countries that are pretty high up, what you might call the US hostility list, the Iran, Russia, Syria, and countries of that type. So I think it's true up to a point that Latin America is singled out, if you like. And among the reasons for that, I mean, obviously we've got the comprehensive sanctions that are applied against Cuba and Venezuela, slightly more targeted sanctions applied against Nicaragua. But one of the things that racks up the numbers in Latin America is the amount of people and entities, companies, and so on, that are sanctioned because of their links to drug trafficking, which is a particularly strong, if you like, Latin American specialization, for want of a better way of expressing it. So if you look at the same source, you look at the number of sanctions in individual countries in Latin America, you get Colombia leading the field with 874, and those are mainly drug traffic related, and then followed by Mexico with 692, again drug traffic playing a particularly important role there, and then other areas with less sanctions. Venezuela, comparatively speaking, has 245 targeted sanctions, and a number of countries have very, very few. Brazil has 12, although Paraguay, where a former president is linked to alleged drug trafficking and other forms of crime, gets a total of 23 sanctions.
Yeah, I would expect Paraguay to have had more, but peculiar there. It seems to fly under the radar. No surprises about Colombia at all. Obviously, the number one coca-producing country. I think the difference between the blanket sanctions for a country and, of course, the focused, targeted sanctions on individuals. We referred many months ago to Nicaragua on this podcast as being a tropical Taliban. The targeted sanctions in Nicaragua, they are aimed at the Ortega family and then his cohort of allies. What can we portend from the sanctions there?
Well, it's really interesting that having applied comprehensive sanctions against Cuba in 1962, comprehensive sanctions against Venezuela from about 2015 onwards, the US government has not applied them against Nicaragua. And it's targeted Nicaragua for individual sanctions and entities. And what they seem to be doing there is targeting everyone who is close to the Ortega-Murillo presidential couple, but not them not the presidential couple themselves, ministers, companies, state companies, they've worked through. I think I said, yes, there's around 250 sanctions in force. Very, very significantly, the US has also said it will use, or it is using its vote in a whole range of financial institutions, including the International Monetary Fund, the Inter-American Development Bank, and others, to discourage lending to Nicaragua in a deliberate attempt to make the economic situation tougher and to encourage a political opening and eventually a return to free elections. But just as the case is with Cuba and Venezuela, there are little to no signs of progress in moving down that road. And I think it's worth mentioning here, we were talking earlier about, do sanctions work? One thing that occurs to me looking at all these different cases is that initially when sanctions are applied, there is a moment of, if you like, potential panic in the country that's being sanctioned. I mean, one example might be the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. That led to pretty massive sanctions applied principally by the US and the European Union. And there was a moment when people were saying, can Russia survive these massive sanctions? It looked as if, their airplane fleet was going to have to be grounded because they couldn't buy US spare parts. It looked really, really difficult. But you go forward 2 years of the Ukraine war, and Russia is doing fine. So I think what sort of happens is there's initial consternation. How do we do? And then a period. How do we cope with this? And then a period in which the sanctioned government finds that, well, there are ways to go. We can send our exports via different routes to different markets. We can adjust this, we can adjust that. And the strange thing, I don't have the exact figure on me, but strange thing is that the Russian economy is going to grow this year, or is growing, and is doing so, in some cases, at faster rates than the European Union. That doesn't take away the fact that sanctions are costing Russia money and missed opportunity, but there are ways of surviving. I mean, if we go back to Latin America for a second, Venezuela has survived at certain point, virtual collapse of oil revenues, and through a combination of things, exporting through tankers that aren't registered in the US or anywhere else, possible drug trafficking income, possible gold mining income. There is a degree of continuity in the economy, or resilience in the economy, that looks quite surprising until you start examining it in greater detail.
Yeah, I too heard the statistic on Russia's growth, and yes, the figure actually escapes me right now. And it's good to bring in Russia and China because this will feed nicely into Venezuela. I mean, as you said, of course, the sanctions, they do cause significant economic pain and difficulties for governments and populations. But we can argue that they fail to expand democracy and dislodge entrenched dictatorial or authoritarian regimes. So you have, in the case of Venezuela and others, an ability to move oil, an ability to move money, an ability to do trade through either, I guess, middle countries or turning off the transponders on your boats. I think it's called the AIS, the automatic identification systems. There are always ways. The individual who springs to mind in Venezuela, who was Alex Saab, who I'm sure has every detail locked up there of how trade is done between Iran and Venezuela and beyond. And he's you see that the way, and again covered in the report, of evading sanctions by creating shell companies, different transshipment routes, and complex transactions, these economic and trade systems appear to be designed to find the loopholes. I don't know what you have to say on the situation of Venezuela. As you said, the sanctions started in 2015, and we've just had, what are widely believed and agreed to have been stolen elections, and Maduro is more entrenched than ever. The argument is very much against sanctions, I think.
I think one is that to avoid sanctions, you need, if you like, a team of Alex Saabs who are skilled in, dealing with whatever you want to call it, the criminal sort of undergrowth of the global economy, and that there is, if you like, a class of people who are situated around Maduro and the institutions of government in Venezuela who actually benefit. If you're evading US sanctions, the likelihood is that commissions on the deal are going to be much higher than they would otherwise be. So there is this class of nouveau riche who benefit from sanctions. So this is kind of, again, it turns sanctions slightly on the head. What it does is kind of reaffirm that it's the bulk of the population that suffers because of sanctions, but that the group around the ruling elite does quite well out of sanctions, and therefore has a lot of incentive to, if you like, to ensconce themselves in power and not to let up. The other point I'd like to make, and I don't want to sound as if everything the US does is wrong, but I think recent events in Venezuela, unfortunately, seem to show that a particular US approach to sanctions has failed. And the approach that's been really tried out under the Biden administration is the idea of calibrating your sanctions. So you'll remember, was it October 22? I'm not sure I've got the date right, but there was a Barbados agreement between the Venezuelan government and the opposition parties in the Plataforma Unitaria Democrática. And the agreement was, which we now know has failed, but it was that the opposition, if you like, pledged to use its good offices to get an easing of US sanctions. And the Maduro government pledged steps towards fair and free elections. We know, given the universal view that the July elections were fraudulent, we know that that deal has failed, basically. But what comes behind it, I think, is the suggestion that by tweaking sanctions, allowing a little bit more of this, a little bit less of that. In the US, they've done it through OFAC, the Office of Foreign Asset Control. What they've done is they issued licenses to oil companies to do a bit more in Venezuela than they had previously been permitted to do, and they kind of offered that as a way of fine-tuning a political opening and a gradual move towards democracy. And what we've seen, or what the latest developments in Venezuela seem to establish, is that the government just wasn't open to that as an idea, and still sees itself as having, total control or nothing.
What do we see happening there, Andrew? You're in a better position as an expert on this. The sanctions will be, I suppose, replaced once again, restored on Venezuela, and The people, once again, will be those that suffer a potential new wave of migration. The statistic that you have as well in the report is that the reduction of food and medicine imports to Venezuela could have increased to 40,000 deaths above normal mortality rates. Again, this is just the regular public. This is not this is the regular population, not the Maduro regime and his cronies. What do we see occurring in I would say, coming months, and sadly, if Venezuela doubles down as it looks to have done into a more Nicaraguan model of draconian laws and repression?
I think at the moment we're definitely going to see bridges being pulled up and a period of increased government repression. I think it comes back to the fact, which we were mentioning earlier, if the US chooses Trump as the next president, US sanctions will remain very, very tight. If they choose Harris, there may be some room for relaxation, but Harris will be saying, well, but what do I get in exchange if under Biden this relaxation happened and the US got precisely nothing in exchange? I come back to the idea that sanctions tell part of the story.
Mm-hmm.
That sanctions inflict economic pain, will be bad for the Venezuelan economy and bad for the Venezuelan population. To get a political opening of some kind, you need something else to happen. What that other thing is, I'm not entirely sure. What we've seen is an attempt, to use diplomacy. We've seen, in recent weeks, Brazil, Mexico, Colombia trying to form a kind of contact group that might get new elections or some kind of agreement between the Maduro government and the opposition. But I think, the Venezuelan government's been in office for over 2 decades, and it seems that everyone has always been expecting some kind of a political opening, which never comes, frankly. I think something else on this chessboard needs to change. The disposition of the army, the fact that there might be splits in the ruling party. All this is, I'm afraid, speculation.
Yeah.
But I think we need to look for some kind of movement on that front that might initiate a process of change.
I think a major point on this, of course, if we think of Colombia's President Petro, who sees himself as a revolutionary and sees himself as a sort of freedom fighter, again against the I would say the yoke of a colonial regime, and Lula in Brazil as well comes very much in that mindset. He is very outspoken against the sanctions in this area, and it raises that question, isn't it? What right does a very wealthy country have, or a very powerful country have, to put sanctions on another one in this situation? And it leads me into the point of this huge argument and discussion that will come into, and is policy, of course, in the US, but will come even more into the debate as we get closer to November. The issue of migration. I mean, to be simplistic, if there was an easing of sanctions perhaps on Venezuela to allow foodstuffs and economic growth, medicines, perhaps there wouldn't be an increased wave of migrations up to the US at that southern border wall. And likewise with Cuba, the numbers of Cubans still making the crossing, going up through the Darien jungle, as we continually talk about on this, there is a possibility, of course, that these numbers reduce.
I think this is probably the US election campaign. Donald Trump has been very keen to say that Kamala Harris was the immigration czar, in control of immigration. that's not exactly true. This is often the case. She was asked to look after initiatives with Central American republics where increased US aid could be used to reduce outward bound migration, and hence the number of people in the United States. So I think it's still an important issue, and it's still something, the Venezuelan economy has contracted by 3/4. It's 3/4 smaller than it used to be, and it has expelled at least 8 million Venezuelans. So if you could get a recovery in Venezuela, it might relieve some of the pressure of the migration flow to the States. But it will take time. You can see something like that taking 2, 3, 4 years before results start coming. And it's quite difficult because you need, perhaps this would need a bipartisan agreement by the main US parties that would, if you like, protect each of them from being undermined by the other over the immigration record.
I think we have time to discuss one more, and obviously quite, I would say, well, it's from left field, really, is Argentina, having placed sanctions due to, Hezbollah and the 1994 bombing of the Jewish Community Center in Buenos Aires that led to the deaths of 85 people. We don't see, obviously, Venezuela placing sanctions or Colombia, but Argentina placing these sanctions puts it in a rarefied group of countries in the global south, of course.
As far as I know, Argentina is not, if you like, aggressively pursuing sanctions against Hezbollah or against Iran. But it did as a result of that tragic bombing in Buenos Aires against DAIA, the Jewish Community Association. It has created this thing called REPET, or Registro, I can't remember the exact title, but it's a registry of people and entities connected to terrorism. And by all accounts, it's quite a well-kept database of people. And the idea is, of course, should any of them come to Argentina or be within reach of the Argentine government, they can be arrested and investigated. Because the other thing about the 1994 attack is that it's never been resolved. Various, court cases have ended up with nothing, going on for more than 20 years. But it does raises at least two points. One is that, as we were saying earlier, there seems to be an unequal balance between those who apply and enforce sanctions and those who are at the receiving end. And the other really important point, I think, to make is that in some cases, sanctions may actually be at odds with international law. Because the way that, certainly in the United States, OFAC, the Office of Foreign Asset Control, can sanction people when it has a reasonable belief that they are involved in wrongdoing. But that's not evidence of the kind the court might require. So it's possible that, if I'm a Paraguayan citizen or a Brazilian citizen and I'm sanctioned, it could be that it's a mistake. They've got my name wrong. And I think I would have very little recourse in law. So there's it may become an issue in the future.
That's a terrifying prospect. As we close this, Andrew, could we say then, looking at the report, looking at the research, and of course all the information available to us, that targeted sanctions as opposed to blanket sanctions against a country, so targeted sanctions such as those towards entities or individuals suspected or accused of narcotics trafficking or human rights violations, corruption, or can make smaller and valuable contributions?
I think so. In part because you've got to judge them in the light of the alternative. If the alternative is comprehensive sanctions, which has a big negative impact on the vast majority of the population, targeted sanctions are much, much better. And the fact that people involved in the drug trade have their assets frozen is unlikely of itself to cause major economic problems for a large part of the population of country X or country Y. So if you're going to have sanctions, targeted sanctions are better. But I think it's also true that targeted sanctions don't always work, because all types of sanctions don't always work. I think they can work in a specific set of circumstances, and we can probably argue about what those circumstances are. I think the other final point, if I may, is that the vast increase in the number of sanctions poses major issues for international companies. The onus is on them to be up to date on who is on which sanction list. It's kind of like a massive know your customer requirement. You, as the bank, and many banks have done that, if you deal with a person who you think is legitimate, you haven't quite looked into his or her background enough, you are responsible. One bank, BNP Paribas, was sanctioned for having known drug dealers as its clients for many years, and they ended up paying a fine of $8 billion, which is one of the largest of its kind in recent history. And fines that size can be applied to you by the US, even though you were perhaps dealing at two removes from the main. If there is a US connection of some kind, the US will claim jurisdiction. So I think the short version of this is most international companies really have had to boost their compliance and risk management departments to be able to cope with a fast-moving, changing situation. Sanctions get lifted on some people and reimposed on others, and you need to be completely up to date with that.
Absolutely, truly fascinating, Andrew. I don't see any alternatives being exercised at the moment or in the immediate future in the place of sanctions. And of course, what would international governments do? But that's not for us to discuss here right now. That's for another report further down the line. We've been talking to Latin American analyst expert Andrew Thompson in the UK. He has a new report out, Sanctions in Latin America, the Regrettable Rise in the World of Prohibitions. We have covered everything from Nicaragua, Venezuela, Cuba, and of course, Argentina, and of putting it all into international, global context. Andrew, thank you so much for your time. It has been a truly enlightening conversation. Well, I've been Richard McColl, your host here on the Latin News Podcast. I'm based in Bogota, Colombia. Be sure to share and, of course, subscribe to the Latin News Podcast. We are back in 2 weeks' time with a further interview about issues of interest from the region. Goodbye.